Okay, coral. We're very familiar with coral, like in the Great Barrier Reef. Coral is also composed of calcium carbonate, and you can see that coral forms rings as it grows, and the thickness of the ring is actually dependent on temperature of the ocean as well. So warmer temperatures, thicker rings. You can also look at the oxygen isotopes within the calcium carbonate of the coral. And again, like we said before, the colder the temperature, the more oxygen 18 you're going to have. The warmer the water is, the more evaporation you're going to have. And so you're going to have evaporation not just of oxygen 16, but also of oxygen 18, meaning that there'll be less of it forming in the coral. Okay, another unicellular organism that you could look at, and this is kind of a freshwater organism, right? So you'll find it in lakes and bogs and things like that, are called diatoms. They have these silica kind of shells that you can see here under the electron microscope, and each of these are specific to species. So again, you can look at the different kinds of species. Some species predominate in brackish water or salt water, some predominate in fresh water, some predominate in warmer temperatures, some in colder temperatures. And also you can see the numbers of diatoms in the lake sediments. So this is doing, instead of ocean cores, lake cores, depending on the amount of food or the amount of nutrients within the water. So for example, you can use diatoms to see when, let's say, a freshwater lake then opened up to the ocean and became kind of a saltwater lake by the diatoms. You could also look at anthropogenic or human-caused changes in the lake, such as living close to the lake and having runoff from fields into the lake, so lots and lots of carbon entering the lake system and producing lots and lots of diatoms which end up on the bottom of the lake. That could show you that, for example, people were living there, farming intensively, and a lot of the soil nutrients were ending up in the lake, and that can show you that humans were having an impact on the environment. All right, so here's another example of a diatom. So a lot of times people look at all of these kinds of data in order to figure out, okay, during this specific period of human history when we know, let's say, important things were going on, did the climate impact what was happening in these societies? For example, the first known empire in the world appeared in Mesopotamia around 2300 BC, so over 4,000 years ago. It collapsed within 100 years. Archaeologists, or some archaeologists, believe there might have been a role played by climate. And by looking at several different measures of ancient climate, such as here you can see calcium carbonate and the oxygen isotopes within calcium carbonate in a core from the Gulf of Oman, right? And then looking at several other measures, what they see is that around a little bit over 4,000 years ago, there was a sharp drop in precipitation, right? And so we can get at precipitation patterns and temperature with oxygen isotopes, and it looks like there was a very dry spell just when this empire collapsed, and many people believe that it probably was a cause and effect relationship, that the changing climate produced too much stress on people, and it caused the system to break down and collapse. It also gives us an idea about wind patterns. The warmer the water, the difference you're going to have in wind direction and wind severity and storm severity. So, for example, during the time period when people from Southeast Asia were making their way to the Polynesian Islands, there were several migrations, but one of the migrations during the 1200s AD Scientists have now discovered that this was a period of low storms. And so it makes sense, or at least it kind of fits into the whole framework, that people would be able to do these large migrations exactly during a period when there were fewer storms right there. Right? Okay, another important way of looking at ancient climate is looking at coastlines. Right? So reconstructing ancient coastlines, and we're going to talk about Beringia in just a moment, but I'll talk about something a little bit closer to home first, and that is Lake Huron. So back in the Ice Age, the lake levels were much lower than we see today, and in fact there was a land spit going right down the middle of Lake Huron. The levels of Lake Huron were much lower. And so archaeologists have been working on the bottom of Lake Huron to find ancient Paleolithic, or the evidence of ancient Paleolithic either settlement or land use, because this was exposed earth surface during that time, around 12,000 years ago or a little bit before. And they think, archaeologists from the University of Michigan think that they have found a hunting blind for ancient caribou, right, down at the bottom, what is now the bottom of Lake Huron, but was then open land. Right? So they've used submarines and other and sonar equipment to find these, and it looks like stones that are set up in the line in order to kind of trap the caribou as the caribou were migrating and being chased by hunters. The migration of people during this time period was made possible because during the Ice Age, when it was colder, sea levels in general were lower, right? About 120 meters lower. And so Siberia and North America were connected. Britain and mainland Europe were also connected. There was no English Channel at that point. And so one of the debates now in archaeology is, did humans come across from Siberia across this land bridge, or did they actually come hugging the coast down to North, Central, and South America? There are different theories, but it's important to be able to find the ancient coastline. What was the coastline at that period compared to today, in order to know where to look for archaeological sites. And so that's another important aspect of climate reconstruction, where you're going to use sonar, you're going to use submarines and things like that to look for habitation and to trace where the ancient coastline was. So, for example, Robert Ballard, who found the Titanic in the Atlantic, has used submarines and equipment like that to look at the ancient coastline of the Black Sea. And according to his research, he believes that around 6000 BC, the Black Sea was much smaller. It had not connected to the Aegean Ocean yet. But then when the Bosphorus opened up and seawater rushed in, the lake levels rose incredibly high, or compared to what they were. And this had an impact, obviously, on the people living there. And related to this is looking at rivers and ancient rivers that may no longer be in existence. So dried up riverbeds that used to supply ancient settlements and cities with water, now those ancient sites are what look like desert, but they used to be connected by water. So using things like satellite photos to identify where some of these ancient river courses were. So you can see here, right, this is the abandoned or the ancient river course is no longer used, and this is the modern river course. So this is obviously important because you can see where people were actually living in relation to the rivers that existed then. If you're just looking at the modern course, let's say, of the Tigris and the Euphrates, you're going to see a lot of settlements that are now in the middle of deserts. And of course, it doesn't make sense that they would have a major city there, So you have to be able to look at the satellite photos in order to reconstruct where these ancient rivers actually were, right? And a lot of times in Mesopotamia or southern Iraq, the settlements will line up in a line in what is now desert, but was actually an ancient river course. So satellite photos can be used for that. Looked at dendrochronology not that long ago and talked about how it was an important tool to date archaeological sites. But tree rings can also be used to reconstruct ancient climates, specifically rainfall patterns. So if you have a dendrochronological sequence for an area, you can look at the thickness of the rings and you can calculate from the thickness the approximate rainfall for that time period, and then see again if the climate had a role to play in some of these changes that we see archaeologically. So for example, excavations at Jamestown in Virginia, and also what's called the Lost Colony of Roanoke. These settlements have been, plotted against the tree ring climate data, and what you can see is this colony Roanoke that was abandoned. Right, when it was abandoned, there was a period of drought, and that may have played a large role in why it was abandoned. There was a little bit of a quote-unquote mystery about where these people went to or what happened to them. Did they die off? Recently, archaeological work has suggested that these people from the Lost Colony moved to local Native American tribes and lived, basically they kind of assimilated into those tribes and lived with those tribes. With Jamestown was not abandoned, but it almost was abandoned. And during the period when it almost was abandoned, when there was high mortality, you can see that, and you can see how narrow these rings are over here. There was a period of pretty intense drought compared to, look at the periods in between and the periods after this drought period, right? So drought may have could have caused the end of Jamestown. It certainly caused a very sharp downturn in the colony, and it may have played a role in the abandonment of Roanoke. And so as we said before, tree rings from living trees can be gotten without harming or killing the tree. You can actually drill a core within the ring to extract, you can say, this core. You can also do it with ancient tree trunks as well in order to get a clearer ring. And then there's a lot of work that has to be done in the lab, measuring the rings and then using them to calculate rainfall. But we have climate data from tree rings, you can see, all over the world. So scientists have been working on this problem for a long time, and we have good reconstructions for many different parts of the world going back thousands of years. Right? Another way of reconstructing ancient climate is by obtaining the remnants of ancient plants and ancient animals. So we're talking about seeds and pollen and wood or animal bones, and using those species of plants and animals to approximate the environment. Obviously, certain plants will do better in warmer environments versus colder environments, or more humid environments versus drier environments. The same goes with animals. And so if you can see a change in the kinds of plants and animals that were found in a certain area, you can get an idea of how the environment might be changing. Right? And you can do this in many different ways. You can obtain pollen. You could obtain, we'll talk about phytoliths. You could obtain seeds. Right? You can obtain remnants of the plants themselves. And so this will give you a good idea of what's going on. So, for example, in North America, if you obtain pollen from archaeological sites, or maybe pollen again from lake cores, so not just diatoms, but actually drilling down into the bottom of a lake, you can recover ancient pollen that blew from trees and plants and settled into the lake, sunk down to the bottom of the lake, and was deposited on the bottom of the lake. And then the next year, more sediments and pollen and things like that piling up on top of it. Right? You essentially get stratigraphy of lake sediment, and within the lake sediment, pollen. You can look at the different kinds of pollen because pollen is specific to species. So under the microscope, you could identify, let's say, pollen from pine versus pollen from oak versus pollen from maple. And so in North America, let's say around 10,000 years ago or 12,000 years ago, you have pollen from grass and conifer trees like pine. And then 2,000 years later, you have more pollen from deciduous trees like oak and maple and things like that. That would indicate to you that you're shifting from a colder, drier environment to a warmer weather environment in the same area. The climate would be changing, right? So pollen is a really good technique to use as well. And so you can get pollen from archaeological deposits and also from lake cores. Here you can see seeds are also specific to species, and the wood grain, the actual cells of the wood, will give you an idea of the species as well. Okay, using this kind of pollen data in Egypt, what people have found is that ancient pollen in sediments in Egypt show that there was actually a drought around 4,200 years ago when the Old Kingdom period, when the time period where they built the pyramids, collapsed. Right? So they think that this drought leading to different changes in the vegetation, which they saw in the pollen, may have caused the collapse of the Old Kingdom. Okay, so trying to extract the pollen from the sediments is important. Another kind of remnant of a plant that you could also obtain is known as a phytolith. Phytolith are the silica shaped or the silica based cell walls within the plant. Right? And in fact, we're talking about very small pieces of silica like sand. Because they're made of silica, they don't decompose, so they can actually be preserved pretty well. And silica is specific, or phytoliths are specific to different species. So by recovering phytoliths, in some cases, you're able to obtain phytoliths where you couldn't obtain pollen because the pollen degraded and rotted away, but the phytoliths will not. You can again figure out, okay, what kind of species of plants were living at this time in this area. Right? Another thing you can look at, and I mentioned this with the reconstruction based on the trees, is you could look at the amount of tree versus grass pollen. If you have a time period with lots of tree pollen, and then you have less tree pollen and more grass pollen, archaeologists tend to interpret that as deforestation, right? The loss of the trees. And then archaeologists try and look for a prospective culprit for the deforestation. Was it natural or were humans involved? A lot of the times at archaeological sites, what people have found is that humans cut down trees. Those trees did not grow back, and what grew in its place was grass. So tree pollen and grass pollen are different from each other enough that, and the phytoliths as well, that when you find them in archaeological deposits, you can then figure out, okay, was this a forest-covered area or was it completely deforested? So the place where we worked in Turkey, if you remember some of those pictures, there were absolutely no trees there. But during the time period that we were studying 4,000 years ago, there were plenty of trees in that area. The pollen data shows us that it was a forest. And in fact, we found deer bones as well. Today, it's only agricultural fields and it's much drier, right? So this is another way of determining if humans had an impact on ancient environments, right? And so by looking at grass pollen versus tree pollen, for example, you can see this decrease in tree pollen, increase in grass pollen. shows clearance by humans, right? This is looking at Europe. You can see the beginnings of farming around 4000 BC. You see decrease in tree cover because of less tree pollen, but increase in grass pollen because of forest clearance for farming. So you could really see human impacts on the environment from looking at pollen of ancient plants.